Welcome back, everybody. As we are continuing talking about topics in education and school, since it is that time of year again, I am really excited to have Katie Ploss on with me today because this is what she does. She is an educational psychologist working with kiddos and schools and helping everybody just function a little bit better together. So we're going to have some really awesome conversations today about how we can help our kiddos in school, how we can work together with schools, also talking about girls specifically. So lots of really cool topics coming up in this episode today. So Katie, please tell us more about who you are and what you do.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. I'm super excited to be here and talk about all these topics that I'm super passionate about. So, a little bit about me is yes, I'm a school psychologist. I've been practicing for 5 years ish now, maybe longer than that, but I've really been in education for over a decade now. I started my career as an educator, as being a teacher. I was in early childhood education, child development, and I'm also a doula. So I do childbirth education and birth coaching. And my big passion is supporting parents and children from birth until like their full developmental experience. So I have this just really wide breadth of experience with all age groups, genders. I've worked with families all over the world. And for the last 5 years, I have been practicing school psychology. I'm from the Midwest, so I'm from the Detroit area, but I got my degree in Chicago. So I've just been beat bopping around the Midwest, and special education's been my jam, for the last few years, obviously. And I love what I do. As much as I loved teaching and being in the classroom, I found that there was so much support needed for teachers and parents. A big part of my job too is supporting teachers in your school teams and creating plans for children and parents so that they feel like their child has accessing their education. And I saw that there was such a gap in that when I was teaching, and I just was so passionate about wanting to be part of that solution. So that's what I do.
That's awesome. And I also want to add that Katie lives in the town that I lived in the first 2 years of my life,
I
which is
know, such
in
a small world.
Michigan. Yeah. So definitely a kind of soul connection there,
Yeah.
that we have spent time in the same place in the world, which
And
is pretty cool.
I know. And like I was saying before we started recording, Michigan people, we just find each other. If you have a connection to Michigan, but you're somewhere on the other side of the planet, I mean, literally, I have met people like out of the country and they're
Uh-huh.
like, oh, I know where your hometown is. I lived 10 minutes from there. And it's just so bizarre. So I love that. And I love all you Midwesties all over the world. So come
That's
home sometime,
awesome.
visit sometime.
That's really cool. So Katie, let me ask you, when it comes to working with kind of kids and families and schools and all that dynamic together, what would you say are some of the things that get maybe in the way, get misunderstood? What are some of the things that make those dynamics between school and family more challenging, and how can we support that relationship more effectively?
Yeah, and there's so many variables that go into that, but I would say, there's equal responsibility of both on the school and on a parent. And what I say to parents all the time is that, we're all very educated, and most teachers nowadays have master's degrees. We're all very knowledgeable people in our fields, and so we're here to provide that professional expertise. But you, as a parent, are the expert on your. And, I'll be honest, there's sometimes I have to remind my school team of that. And that's kind of my superpower as a school psychologist. And just my like personality is I was raised by entrepreneurs. So I have not like a salesy, businessy flair when I meet with parents, but I do have this idea that I want to collaborate and I want to treat it like this professional collaboration. And I do want parents to have access to participate in that. So I think it's multiple things, but as far as parents, it's that mutual respect. And the reality is many parents, and especially parents that potentially have neurodivergent children, is there's a higher likelihood that they are neurodivergent neurodivergent themselves. And
Right.
so they had a lot of times a negative school experience. And
Yeah.
so they come into a meeting with a principal, teacher, you're sitting in a conference room full of all these people and it's very intimidating. So you come in defensive. I have lots of parents come in defensive, and I have a lot of parents coming in by the time I'm pulled into the equation that they didn't feel heard. So
Mhm.
there's this just ton of defensiveness and frustration and anger that I all the time kind of trying to sift through and navigate to get to the root of the problem and provide some practical solutions. So I think it's just really wearing that hat that you are your child's advocate and also being willing to collaborate and like really have excellent communication skills so that you can get your child's needs met.
Yeah, that's a great way to say that. It's interesting because I find that my background is also public special education, and I find talking to parents sometimes that there's such a wide range of knowledge levels in
Mm.
terms of what special education is and how it works and that kind of thing. I was talking to a parent a couple months ago who was her son's in lower elementary, and she was pretty unclear about the purpose of his IEP and what kind of support he was getting and what kind of support he was needing. And her goal was to have him dismissed from special education. And when I had asked for his paperwork, I could see that there wasn't even a clear understanding of what all the documents were. And so I think that's a challenge as well. As I think the special education system, there's so much that goes into it and is a part of it, and it depends on what your child's diagnosis is, and I think it can cause parents to feel like they don't know what's going on, and nobody likes to feel that way, right? Nobody likes to feel like they don't understand something, and especially when it comes to your child and their education. So
Yeah.
I think because the special education system can be so complex, I
Yeah.
think it almost lends itself to that, to parents. It makes it easier for parents to feel like they don't really understand what's going on. And I think that's sometimes that can be where some of the defensiveness comes from. And there's also so many acronyms
I was
and
going to say that.
terminology and things like that, yeah, I can see how it would be easy to get lost in the conversation if you're not really sure what people are talking about.
I mean, to be honest with you, like general education teachers are lost in most special education conversations and their teachers.
That's very true.
So,
Yeah.
as parents, it is even more so difficult. And it's fascinating because in my career, because over the span of my career, I have worked in districts where like the average income level is six figures or higher, the average. And then and currently I am contracting with Detroit Public Schools. So inner city, like total, like I mean, literal opposite ends of the spectrum, right? Like I was on the North Shore of Chicago, which is like where Mean Girls was based off, Home Alone, like literally the town where the Home Alone house is where I, was at. And then Detroit is where I'm at now. And I've been everywhere in between as far as demographics and dynamics. And that totally changes the approach often that we take with families is that I take with parents is I want to meet every parent exactly where they're at. So I have sat in meetings with parents that are doctors and lawyers, especially lawyers, and they're firing out these questions. And I'm like, I'm on my toes, like, okay. And then I have to remind myself. And I remember I was in a training recently and they said the average reading level of parents across the US is like actually about like the third grade level. And and then they did like this inventory of all these psych reports. And it was like all of these psych reports we wrote are at the collegiate level in language. And so there are parents I know in my job now that I don't think they can actually read my report. But we're on the other side of that, just from the educator perspective, the special ed perspective, a lot of the acronyms and all the paperwork and all of those things were put in place to protect, for procedural safeguard purposes, to protect children and parents and to assure that students have access to education. So it's like a double-edged sword. It's like all of this stuff is what's legally protecting your child and providing that access to them. But on the other side of it's a bear. There's so much to sift through. IEPs are like 20, 30 pages long. And then
Mhm.
if you have your child's evaluated, if it's a 3-year or an initial IEP, you have maybe multiple specialist reports that you're sifting through. It is insane.
Yeah.
And a lot of schools just don't have the resources, the time, the parent doesn't have the resources or the capacity to sit and go through all of it. It's just really overwhelming. So,
Mhm.
it's knowing like again, that communication and what questions to ask, how to ask them, when to ask them. And it's up to us on our end to make sure that we're communicating the information in a way that's digestible.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do think, especially families that are coming from situations where finances are a factor, I think they have less time to kind of figure things out and ask questions. They might not even be able to meet with school staff because of their work situation. They have less flexibility.
Mhm.
They sometimes have less education themselves to really
Mhm.
be able to understand what's going on. So I feel like I'm kind of rambling right now, but my original question was, what are some strategies or suggestions that you have to just kind of help everybody come together and keep the kiddo at the center of the whole process?
So I think it's one, going into whether you're getting your child initially evaluated for an IEP or you're, I call them veteran parents that have, you're at your child's like 10th
Established.
IEP or whatever, um, is really having a good handle on what is offered at your school district. Because and it breaks my heart because a lot of parents come to meetings like defensive or just like really passionate about wanting to advocate for their child and have these like really great ideas for what their child as a learner would benefit from. And like I've said, I mean, you are the number one advocate for your child. However, if you're going into that meeting and you have no concept of what actually your school and district offer and their continuum of services, because that varies district to district, state to state. And if you have not done your homework, and when I say homework, it's just like go on the school's website and just start looking around at the departments and what programs are housed where and etc. you're It's going to be difficult to have a conversation because you're coming in with an expectation that our programming is going to be able to meet this need, and it might not. We might have to get creative. We might have to, you know, it might not look exactly how you're picturing it in your head. And that it breaks my heart because in the same way that parents feel like they're victims to the system and that they feel like their children are victims to the system, educators are too often. And I have seen like exasperated principals just like, how can I help this kid? And they just don't have the resources and they don't have the manpower, the capacity, they don't have the funding. And they're we're like, I think going into any meeting with we're all doing our best is, the best way to do it, but it's also doing your homework. So studying, like sitting online when you do have time, looking at your school's website, what's available. I also often send parents, and I'm sure you've shared this on your show at some point, is understood.org.
Mm.
They have really digestible information just about the process, about your child's individual disability, just being neurodivergent, what the scope of services are, 504 plans versus IEPs. And it is really readable and digestible to like people that don't have the capacity to sit there and figure out what all this means and this super intimidating legal jargon that's all over IEP paperwork. So those two things is typically where I say start with that. Like there's so much available to us right at our fingertips on our phones, and almost everyone has a smartphone now. So there's just a lot out there. The understood.org also just came out recently with an app and it's called Wonder, WUNDER. And again, just like really digestible, readable information. And if you have an iPhone or an Android, it's right there for you. So
Yeah.
some of those things of just accessing free, like there are low cost and free resources that are available to you to prepare yourself for a meeting with your school team.
And I think one of the typical things that happens when families are feeling maybe a little bit confused or overwhelmed is I think it's common to maybe go to social media and ask a question about something. But special education can be a polarizing topic. And I think if you're going onto even your Facebook page or Facebook groups and asking questions, you're the responses that you get may not be accurate, they may not be helpful, they may not be respectful, right? And I'm sure any parent who has posted a question about anything related to parenting in any kind of group has witnessed that, right? That you get people who are giving you suggestions and helpful, hey, check this out, check this out. But then you get people who are questioning your parenting decisions, and then you get people who are blasting the school. And so I think that resource understood.org, or your school district's website, I think it takes the emotionality out of everything. If you have a question about special education in general, maybe your kiddo was just diagnosed, maybe they're transitioning to a new school. Definitely I would say the route that would probably be the easiest to follow would be to just do some legitimate research as opposed to asking questions in social
Facebook
media groups, forums, that kind of thing, because you're not always getting information, you're getting opinions and judgments and things like that. And you're
100%.
also not always getting information that's legitimate or valid. So
100%. I love that you brought this up. I love this. One, because one of the district that I worked at for the longest, actually the town had a Facebook group called Mom Chatter, like the district's name, Mom Chatter. And I would just sit there and watch people. I mean, just pop off Facebook groups in general. Like, I feel like a lot of moms are on Facebook groups. So I think this is relevant. There is so much toxic negativity and inaccurate information on these forums. What I do like about the Wonder app that understood.org put out is that there is a place where you can actually ask questions and an expert will answer them. Like someone that has a specialty in this or a certain expertise will answer your question versus Bobby's mom around the corner that is going to have a very different answer for you that might not be accurate. And I it's so true. Like on one end, we do have all this great information right at our fingertips, but we have kind of gone away from really emphasizing looking at reputable sources. I remember back when I was in school, the internet was kind of like becoming a thing. They were drilling that into our head. Like, you do not use unreputable sources. And now it's like, if I saw it on TikTok, if I saw it on Facebook, this is the word. And it's not true. I mean, I'm just putting together a birth education course for new moms. And I said, I had the same spiel of like, stop getting your newborn parenting advice from TikTok. Like, you got to stop doing that. There are reputable people that are going to give you the right information for you to be empowered to make informed decisions. So you want to empower yourself with information. You want to listen to things, podcasts from people that do have training in this, looking at understood.org, consulting with your school district and your team, people that have actual reputable knowledge, training, and information on these topics. And you're empowering yourself with that information to make the right decisions for your child. And it's again, like I want to remind parents that you're making really big life-changing decisions for your child when you're talking about their educational placement, when you're talking about getting them diagnosed. A lot of parents really kind of brush off this whole diagnosis, like get my kid an IEP. It doesn't mean anything. It means a lot. And treat it like everyone should be treating it like that from day one. So I love that you brought that up. Very true. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I'm very passionate about that. find reputable sources and have these conversations with individuals that can put you in a positive direction. And you're
Yeah.
still in
Yeah.
the driver's seat as their parent. Like, whether you're like wherever you're posting, wherever you're asking questions, you should always feel like empowered that this information you're getting is going to empower you. Am I putting this in a space where it's going to empower me and inform me to build my parenting toolbox and to be able to make informed, empowered decisions that are going to be for the betterment of my child?
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of toolbox, I know that's something that you like to talk about as well, just the concept
Mhm.
of parents having a toolbox. So
Yeah.
tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of pressure. It's good. It's nice we're talking about social media. I think there's a lot of pressure, more so now than ever, but there's always been this pressure of, we have to like get it right by our kids. We have to do it perfect, especially if you had a hard childhood or your parents, there's a lot of things you would do differently, right? Most of us could, pick out easily the things we would do differently than our parents did, right? So a lot of people go into parenting like that. Also, a lot of women feel very anxious about needing to know everything. I see this especially with new parents, and I see it with parents of neurodivergent kids. And there's this defensiveness. If I don't know everything, I'm going to look bad, or I'm not, the best parent for my child because I don't know X, Y, and Z. And so I like using the analogy of a toolbox of that you don't need to hold all of this information and resources in your own brain. I mean, there are people like, look at me. I have been doing this for a decade. I've been a doula, a early childhood educator, a school psychologist. I'm about to have my doctoral degree. And when I do become a parent, I'm still not going to know everything about parenting. I am still going to probably like have one of those like parenting meltdowns at some point, multiple times. And, I have this like super huge toolbox of all this training I've had, right? So, my parents always make fun of me too. They're like, sorry, you weren't raised by a psychologist. They let me laugh. But you don't have to become a child psychologist to be an adequate parent. So, and most people aren't. So that's what the toolbox idea is that you're empowering yourself with tools. So when you get stuck and you don't know how to respond to something, or your normal response isn't working anymore and you need to change it up. And this is like any parenting topic, anything that you're navigating as a parent at any age of your child's development, you can just go to your toolbox and ask the right expert the right question, get the right intervention put in place, try something new, and keep, not inventing new strategies, but incorporating different strategies based on what's happening in real time with your child.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sorry, I'm trying to put my thoughts into words. The concept of your toolbox could even contain people, right? That it
Literally,
doesn't,
yes.
yeah,
People are
you don't have
resources.
to always be the one with the answers. So even for me, I was a special education teacher for a very long time. I don't really deal with education anymore in that regard. So I don't really, there's no part of my program that's academic. I can give parents advice and suggestions and recommendations because that is my background, but that is not my zone of genius now. Now my zone of genius is social. But because of that, I am an expert in social, whereas someone who's an expert in instruction probably isn't an expert in social. And so I think it's helpful to have people, and it could even be, I was talking to a parent yesterday who's in a couple different monthly membership groups and just parent programs like that. It could even be that you have a different go-to person for different kids or for different situations or for different topics. It's like I said, I may be your go-to for social skills, but I am probably not your go-to for academics. So I think it's just helpful to identify, even if it's people you don't actually know. So I know there's people, listening to this podcast that don't actually know me. There's a bunch of people that do, but there's also people who don't. But I can still be your resource in your toolbox, right? My program can still be an option in your toolbox. Sending an email, asking a question can still be an option in your toolbox. So I think just identifying people who are maybe experts in different areas that you really relate to and resonate with, because none of us like to have, none of us like to reach out to somebody that we don't feel like we relate to. But finding people that you relate to what they talk about, maybe you relate to their personality, their experience, whatever, and then joining a program, joining their Facebook group, getting on their email list so that you're getting information from them on a regular basis. And it just helps you feel more connected to that person. But then it's also a resource maybe when you're not sure what to do or when things are changing, and you can connect with that person on a more personal level.
Absolutely. And ways you can do that. I mean, you can, when you find someone, right, you identify like someone like you might have recommendations that you resonate with that, could be added to that parent's toolbox. And it's also evaluating, what do you consider yourself a parenting expert in and what are you not? Like, so for me as a school psychologist, the things that I consider myself an expert in are executive functioning, identifying, evaluation, assessment data, systems, like school systems and how they work and function. So those things, like, that's my wheelhouse. But I want to be more of an expert on is like reading, like reading acquisition. So I've been doing more learning about that, but I defer to experts in general education and reading specialists and those individuals that are going to help me, empower me to make the right recommendations to a parent that maybe we're identifying their child with a reading disability, right? So everybody in every profession, every role in your life should have some type of toolbox like this. And it's empowering to admit that you don't know everything.
Yeah.
There's empowering and there's peace in that, like to let go of this expectation that you need to know everything. But what I want to empower you is you want to know where to find it. It's like the number one job advice I ever got as a teenager, and I was like learning to be a real person, was you don't have to know everything, but just know where to go ask a question. And it's the same thing with parenting. There is so much to parenting. I say this to my new moms. Part of my birth ed process is like find a local lactation consultant that you jam with, their social media, their website. Make sure you have your pediatrician lined up, and all those things. That doesn't just stop when you have a baby, though. I mean, life and their development is going to change and ebb and flow as they grow as people. So you want to continue to do that throughout this process, especially if you have a neurodivergent kiddo. You're going to need a bigger team. That's okay. But you want to make sure that you have that in place and you have people that you connect with. I want to go to some for me, like I picture in my head like a stuffy, really like blank psychiatrist that like is just like going to be very dismissive. Like somebody like that wouldn't be someone that I would necessarily put in my toolbox. They might have a ton of great information for me, but I'm not connecting with them.
Right.
And so it's not going to resonate in a way that I'm going to apply.
Right. Yeah.
So that's important. I love that you brought that up too, is really be intentional about what you're putting in your toolbox, and it needs to resonate with you and be right for you as a parent.
And I think too, it's really important for parents to be able to connect with other parents whose kids are similar. And so in our world, that means, neurodivergent, but it could even be more specific than that. It could be, maybe you're a bilingual family. Maybe you're the parent of twins who are neurodivergent. There's some families in my world who've got multiple kids who are neurodivergent. Maybe your kiddo is transgender. Maybe, I think it's
like have the same talents and hobbies,
yeah,
I mean, even as simple as that, like both of your kids are really good at X, Y, and Z. They both love this sport. They love this hobby. Especially I love giving that recommendation for parents that have students on the spectrum, is like maybe if like you both have kids that are neurodivergent on the spectrum and they have the same specific interests, because there's like common specific interests usually in age groups, that's like a really great person to connect with. You guys are going to be having a lot of things to relate to each other on, that you can have some really powerful, validating conversations where you're not necessarily giving people advice or suggestions or information, but just sharing your experience and having a safe place to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I recently learned, it's interesting because I'm working with a student who's in college right now. We're working one-on-one, and we were having a conversation about finding people with similar interests. And he said that he didn't necessarily agree with that strategy because to him, similar personalities was more important. And I thought that was such a great observation that he said it doesn't really
Yeah.
matter if we have the same interest if we don't get along. And
So
so
true.
right, that was such an insightful observation from him. And so we talked about how, typically, for example, people who like to be funny prefer to be around people who think they are funny.
Yes.
Just things like that. People who like to be seen as intelligent prefer to be around other people who, have the same, mindset about that. And so I just thought that was a really interesting conversation. And I think with parents, when your kiddo has so in my program, I have shapes that identify different personality types. So
I love
even
it.
finding other parents whose kid is the same shape as yours, because a lot of the challenges, a lot of the wins, a lot of the successes, other parents whose child is the same shape as yours will really relate to that. Whereas parents who have kiddos who are a different shape, they may have never experienced that, right? Good, bad, positive, negative, whatever. They just may not be able to relate to that. But if they're similar personality type, they're right there. Oh yeah, that that was us a year ago, or whatever the case may be.
I think
Okay.
something that works for me is, when I'm making any suggestion to a parent or just like to anybody about anything, it really just is a suggestion. And that's what, like, why I love doing yoga and things. It's like the yoga teacher is always really good about, I'm going to be giving you suggestions, but if you just want to sit here in child pose for an hour, that's great. And I love that for you. And I really take that approach when working with people. It's like, maybe for somebody, like the personality piece is going to really be the game changer. For somebody else, it might be a different way. It might be a different strategy. There's multiple ways to achieve the same goal. And so, it's just really giving people, again, a toolbox to empower them with information to make the right choices and make their experience individual. We're all individuals. Different things are going to work for different people, and I would avoid anybody that tries to make blanket statements of what you should or shouldn't do about anything.
Yes.
Being
Yeah.
neurodivergent myself, I don't respond well to that. So I don't put that stuff out there either.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of different personality types, just different kind of dynamics when it comes to kiddos, I also want to talk about your knowledge, your expertise when it comes to different subgroups of neurodivergent kids. So if we talk about identification, services, just all that kind of stuff.
So like more of like their demographic backgrounds, like
Mhm.
race, gender,
Yes.
all that. So there's so much research behind the reality that especially in the US, but this is something that's prevalent all over the world, is that girls, people of minority races, African American, Hispanic, that are English is not their first language, LGBTQ plus. I mean, so many different groups are less likely to get identified for services than Caucasian boys. So if you have ever been in special education in most places in the country, if you walk into a classroom, special education classroom, most of the time, unless the district has, not very many Caucasian students, most of the people in that room will be Caucasian boys, just statistically, when you look at like the whole US. And there's lots of reasons for that. One, and I think the biggest one is we don't have a great understanding as a field, and I say field like psychology and psychiatry, of how different neurodivergent symptoms present differently in different subgroups. So girls, for example, ADHD is one because I was diagnosed as an adult with ADHD. And so it's one that I have just read a lot about personally. There are so many girls, and it's ASD and autism are the big two, that girls get diagnosed much later in life, either later in their elementary, middle school, high school experiences, or post secondary. And it's because often the way that girls present don't align with the criteria that are in the DSM, the diagnostic manual that, doctors use to make these diagnoses. When I look at the DSM for ADHD now, I didn't meet a lot of the criteria as a kid. That doesn't mean that I didn't have ADHD. It's that the field doesn't have the research and the knowledge behind them to know that as a girl it looked different for me than
Right.
it did in a boy. And so there's just a lot that we don't know. With male, African American males, a lot of what we talk about is the over identification of cognitive impairments
Mm.
and the cognitive assessments that we give during psychoeducational evaluations are often culturally biased. So it provides an underestimate of non-Caucasian people being tested. They look like they have a lower IQ than they really do. And it's just a cultural bias. It has nothing to do with their actual intelligence. And so these things that are in place that we have to legally use to, you know, identify kids, get them the supports that they need, the way that society and culture has socialized different genders to behave, all of these things go into why certain subgroups are under identified and then don't get as many of the access to the services that they do need, are qualified to have, and would maximize their access to their education. And then the long-term impacts of that obviously are great. People have, higher likelihood of dropping out of high school, don't higher likelihood of teen pregnancy, all these detrimental outcomes that impact the educational success or career of an individual. So, I mean, it is something that a lot of people in the field are passionate about working on, but these things take generations, decades, lots of time. And as a parent, it's very important that you are your child's advocate because you're the individual advocate for them. And we're all up against this system, every single one of us, whether we're the ones evaluating. And as a school psychologist, they often call me the gatekeeper. I have the keys to the special ed room. And, that's a very heavy decision that weighs on us too, even though, it seems like we're holding the power. I mean, we're all in this system and we're all trying to navigate it the best we can to do right by kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think another thing that's interesting is that I think the culture has really shifted in the US to where having a diagnosis is almost like a fad now, right? It's
Yeah,
almost like
the
it's a
trendy
cool,
thing.
yes, trendy is a really great word. It's trendy now to be neurodivergent. And
Mhm.
so I think I actually saw something recently about how um I'm not on TikTok. I have never even been on the app, but I saw something recently about how there is a feeling that TikTok is actually contributing to negative stereotypes of things like ADHD and autism because people are going on there and posting and claiming that they have these diagnoses and the things they are saying are not valid, they're not accurate, they're not helpful, they're not supportive. And I think it's trendy to say that you're neurodivergent. And there's even, people will say things like, oh, we're all a little bit ADHD or, like spectrum-y, right? Like there's even things that people say that allude to the fact that we're all somewhere under that umbrella, which is obviously a little offensive to those of us who are, because I guarantee your daily life is not a challenge like my daily life is. But I think in other cultures, there is still some cultures where a diagnosis or a disability is a stigma. And so
Mhm.
I think there's some cultures where um there's actually resistance and reluctance to having their kiddos evaluated and identified because in that culture there's still, stigma around that. So I think it's interesting how I think things have actually split and become even more extreme in American culture versus other cultures, even if they are living in America. So I think that's a part of it too, is some cultures not wanting that. And then in America, I think it's become something that people actually seek out, even when there might not even be, justification for it.
So it's one, knowing how your culture interacts with neurodivergence and how your child might be impacted by that. And then it's also on top of that, being intentional about what media you're consuming. I mean, seriously, like on Instagram, I am so intentional about who I follow of big creators. Like TikTok is a little bit different because the way that it's set up, you have the algorithms just kind of giving you stuff. I mean, that's like how most people consume TikTok, is not even necessarily people they're following. But on Instagram, I am so intentional. Like, body image has been a big thing for me forever. So I follow creators that look like me, that have body neutrality, that talk about body in a way that aligns with how I value and think about it, and how I have navigated that journey within myself. And it's a very personal thing. I'm not going to give anybody a blanket statement on what type of material to consume, but you need to consume material that aligns with you,
Mhm.
and
And that makes you
whatever that
feel good.
is, and that makes
Right.
you feel good, and that
Yeah.
feels healthy to you, and you don't walk away feeling uneasy, anxious, unaligned. I mean, your body's going to give you clues when things don't feel right and don't sit
Mhm.
right. Listen to those, get in tune with your cues, and having that awareness and that time to reflect, even if you're journaling about it, or you're going to therapy about it, or you're just talking to your family about it, of how your culture, how your child's identity could be interacting with their educational experience, knowing what your racial background is, what your religious background is, cultural background. Because some cultures it is more stigmatized, and some it's like a trendy thing to do. So it's knowing and being careful about not getting caught up in some of those more negative
Mhm.
dynamics that could be harmful.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, like in the pursuit, like some of the negative, like when I've talked about this topic with people before, one negative, like, or critical opinion, or like the, I guess, devil's advocate opinion is like, if I'm just consuming content that is the same opinion as mine, or, I agree with, then I'm not going to grow as an individual. I'm not going to
Mm.
get to know other people's, backgrounds and things. Which there are ways outside of social media that you can diversify your life and diversify your experience. And like, that's a whole other episode. You could probably make a whole podcast about that. But the point is that in general, as human beings, we are obviously at most ease when we're around people that agree and validate us.
Mhm.
But I always say this to parents, and it's like whenever someone asks me to do a parenting talk and like just do like a general, I somehow figure out a way to just sneak in this whole concept of validation. And because people, again, that's another word that's a huge buzzword on the internet, validation. You need to validate me. A lot of people are just saying you need to agree with me, and they don't really understand that validation is not agreeing. So it's the same concept of when you're talking to your friends or your family, or you're sitting in a meeting for your child's IEP, you can not agree with a person and still validate what they're saying. Validation is just a simple acknowledgement. I acknowledge your
That
experience.
they're feel it's valid. Yes.
I
Yes.
acknowledge. I said this in a to one of my clients the other day, and she was like, "Well, if I needed to hear that, all of our feelings are valid, but not all of our feelings are fact." And there's a difference between fact and feelings. The reality is that our perception is our reality. So often our feelings do feel very real. And that's why they're valid,
Right.
because you are really
They're real
experiencing
to
that.
you.
They're
Right.
real.
Yeah.
They are real. Like, genuinely, they're real and they're valid. But that doesn't mean that they are facts. So when you're sitting in a charged meeting, or you're just really charged about something that happened at your child's school, or that you didn't get an answer you wanted to get, or whatever it is that you're just feeling frustrated or don't know what to do next, and you're having a hard time communicating with your school team, or I mean, as I've worked in a lot of districts, I mean, there are other school educators that I am like unable to collaborate with.
Mhm.
And there's been various reasons for that, and a lot of it comes down to like, we just don't have that communication style that vibes, right? So you're gonna, in your child's school experience, they're gonna have a teacher you don't vibe with, they're gonna
Mhm.
have a principal you don't vibe with. Like, I guarantee this will happen to you between preschool and 12th grade. This will
Mhm.
happen. You're not gonna like all their teachers, you're not gonna like all their service providers, you're not some of them you're gonna be like, I don't even know how you got your license. Really don't. I mean, I seriously have said these things out loud and thought them. Like, it's just the reality of it, and going into one, those meetings knowing that even if it's not being said, but if there's like someone on your team that is like the weak link, I mean, we probably all know it, but it's how do we navigate that in a way that we're here for the child and we're going to do what we can do with the toolboxes we all have. I go into the meeting and I just let them be seen. I
Mm,
let their experience be seen, be heard. That's all we want. And that's something I remind my teams too. Like, this is way more personal to that parent than it is to any of us.
mhm.
So let's, give them the floor and let them be heard and let's answer all of their concerns. I might not be able to give you everything you want. I'm tied by the law, I'm tied by policy, I'm tied by resources. There's a lot of things that tie my hands, and I can't just give a parent every single thing they ask for, but I can communicate and
Right.
validate that that's a valid question you're asking, and I'm not going to dismiss you just because I can't give it to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that, like, because there's a lot of meetings I have where kids don't qualify for an IEP. There's a
Right.
way that I could communicate that where that parent would walk away pissed off. And a lot of parents do walk away from those meetings frustrated because they weren't validated in their concerns. And so
Right.
that's kind of my superpower and like why my school teams love me and get sad when I leave because they're like, oh, like you just have a way of saying it. And it makes me kind of chuckle because everybody could do this. It's not really a superpower. It's just having an understanding about how can you validate someone's experience. And it's the same way with your child.
That's where I was going. That's a big thing that I talk about is with my kids, everything you feel is okay. It's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to be angry. It's okay, and sometimes I'll even say to them, yeah, I would be really upset if that happened to me too. It's okay to feel the way that you feel. Even, sometimes if something's a misunderstanding, I would be
To
frustrated if
agree
I
with you.
thought that that's what happened too. It's always okay to feel the way that you feel. We just talk about being mindful of the choices that we make when we feel that way. But however
Right.
you feel is always valid. It's always okay to feel. So even the concept of overreacting, to me, I don't believe there's such a thing because it's always valid how you feel. We just want to be mindful about the choices that we're making. So there could be, reactions that don't match the situation, but the way you feel about it is okay. It's okay to be frustrated or embarrassed or scared or worried or, whatever.
Yeah, I
Okay.
don't know if you're familiar with the zones of regulation, but like
Mhm.
the 5 zones, and then there's like a lesson in there that talks about size of the problem and helping kids
Mhm.
evaluate the size of the problem. And the funny thing is, and the reality is that a lot of the lessons that we try to teach our little kids are the lessons that we needed and did not get.
Mm.
And we don't, and because of that, we didn't get them. A lot of adults are walking around the world emotionally dysregulated, and it impacts all of their relationships and all of their interactions with people around them. And then they wonder why their kid is overreacting because they spilled, their cereal on the floor and they're
Right.
screaming and
Right.
like a lot of the experts will come back with, well, developmentally and blah blah blah. Yeah, it's important to know, developmentally what your kid's brain it can handle and can't handle yet is still developing. But also, it's just so simple as like, I see you're having a hard time. You don't have to
Mhm.
agree with it. Do I agree when a child even a parent in an IEP meeting is like screaming or is like supercharged over something really tiny? No. I don't, and I don't lie either. I'm
Mhm.
never like I don't just pacify people and condescendingly pat them on the head either. It's just that wow, I see you. And this is hard. This is a hard thing right now. And like, we're going to come together to solve this problem and let's figure out the size of the problem. Let's dip into our toolbox. Just like you need a toolbox, every single human being needs a toolbox.
Right.
And, that is something that when you can just give yourself that compassion, when you can give your child that compassion, you can give your school team and the people even within your toolbox that compassion, human to human, that can just maximize every area of your life, and
Yeah.
especially when things are hard, like you're trying to figure out how to support your neurodivergent kiddo.
Yeah. And I just want to add my 2 cents before we wrap up about the concept of size of the problem. I am not a huge fan of that concept because clearly the child feels like this is a big problem, if that makes sense. And so what
Yeah.
I have said in the past that has been really helpful, it actually just was a download from the universe into my brain one time when I was supporting a kiddo who was really struggling, is I knew that if I said something like, is this really a big problem that he would absolutely lose it? And so I was like, there's no way I'm going to say something like that. But what I said to him was, man, I bet this feels like a really big problem right now. And then I just paused, and then he switched from emotional to logical brain, and we were able to talk about what was happening. And so then my focus is on, how can we solve this problem? So regardless of what size it is or feels like, I think the focus is, okay, how can we, because maybe to, like, obviously to them, it was a big, he was having a meltdown over it. Okay, this really feels like a big problem. How can we solve this problem? And I think that concept is a much more beneficial concept than size of the problem, because size of the problem is relative. And again, it's based on your perception. So the same thing happening to two different people could very much be two different sizes of the problems, if that makes sense. Yeah. Awesome. Katie, thank you so much for being here today. This is a really great conversation about supporting our kids, supporting parents, supporting school staff, kind of, all of us that are here in the best interest of our neurodivergent kiddos. So before we go, please tell everybody where they can find you online.
Yeah, so like I said, I'm a school psychologist, but I'm also a women's wellness coach. I do have a podcast. It's currently in the middle of a renaming, so I'm just going to send you to my website to see what's happening over the next couple months. It is
I understand.
yeah, it's always changing, but I'm always in a new season, evolving, right? I love to embrace that. But my business is called Be You, a women's wellness community. We're all here to embrace exactly who we are authentically at every age and stage. So I work with girls of all ages and women and moms of at all developmental ages too. So definitely check that out. It's bucmty.com. And then I'm on Instagram and TikTok with the same handle, and Facebook with the same exact handle.
Okay.
bucmty.
Awesome. Katie, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who's listening. We'll see you again next week.